Now, before I pass the mic over, I guess, to Kevin, who's our moderator, just a couple of housekeeping notes. You will have, obviously, the opportunity to ask questions during the webinar, but we ask you to save them to the end. We also ask you to type your questions into the question box, given the volume or the number of people who are attending today. Also, you will be able to submit questions after the fact, after the session is ended. You will also receive a copy of the recording of this webinar after the session is ended. And look for our survey. You'll see we want to get your evaluation of the quality of the presentation itself. So without further ado, I will now pass it over to Kevin Wong. Kevin?
Thank you, everyone, for attending today. I'm Kevin Wong, Technical Manager here at CIPH. And let me introduce the speakers before we start. So we have Kevin Ernst, who is the General Manager of OS&B and the current Chair of CSA B125 and the Chair of the Plumbing Industry Advisory Council. We also have Project Managers Laurel Pila and Ken Fu from CSA, and they deal with the lion's share of the plumbing standards within the organization. We also have Franco DeFalco, who's Technical Advisor for CSA on the plumbing group. The purpose of this webinar is to address some of the confusion out there in the marketplace, some of the low-lead products and requirements in Canada. In the last 6 months, we've noticed many very diverse questions come to CIPH about low-lead requirements, to product availability, what's required in code, and what to do with something that's not in code yet. There's a lot of confusion with U.S. requirements, and some of that work, especially around the exemptions, and how they affect Canada. This webinar is all about asking questions, so please do. As Steve mentioned earlier, please type in your questions into the question box. If we can't answer it, we will attempt to ensure that the appropriate parties receive the question. On the web services when evaluating pipes, valves, fittings, and plumbing fixtures anticipated to convey or dispense water for human consumption through drinking or cooking. This is a U.S. regulation, folks, and what we really have to focus on here is that the regulation looks at the word anticipated. In California and in Canada, we've gone a different route, and the word that is key to this is intended. To give you a little bit of an understanding of what's happening in Canada and how it's precipitated, let me introduce our next panelist, Mr. Kevin Ernst. He's General Manager at OS&B, Chair of the B125 Committee, and Chair of the Plumbing Industry Advisory Committee.
Thank you, Kevin, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. The national system of plumbing codes that can be adopted by the provinces and enforced through the recognized network of plumbing and health inspectors. Of course, this has caused many questions to be asked. So we can go on to the next slide. We'll see a little triangle depicting how codes and standards work in Canada. We have the National Plumbing Code of Canada, and this National Plumbing Code is written by the National Research Council, the Canadian Code Centre. As input to this code, the Provincial Territorial Policy Advisory Committee on Codes, or PTPAC, provides inputs to the codes. The NPC is published every 5 years. There is one interim change during the code cycle. When it's published, the MPC is available for adoption by the provinces and territories. This can take from a few months to years to happen. The MPC is essentially an installation code for product requirements. The code primarily references standards, for instance, CSA B125. Manufacturers have their products tested and certified to these standards to demonstrate compliance, and thereby are allowed by the certification body to mark the product with the certification mark. For example, CSA, UPC, or accuracy, NSF. Nothing was written into the code regarding lead. The lead requirements have been written into the standards. These updated standards must be referenced in the code for the lead requirement to be required. Canada has a trusted system of enforcement. By updating the standards that are referenced in the code, we keep this enforcement in place, unlike the US where it is a federal law and the enforcement of the law is unclear. If we want to look at products that are involved with this change, we can go to the CSA B125.1 standard. And this was updated in 2012 and was published then. What happened in 2012 was that clause 4.93 was added to the standard. And that is where the requirement for the low lead was given, where it says in 493, fittings intended to convey or dispense water for human consumption through drinking or cooking shall not contain a weighted average lead content in excess of 0.25% when evaluated in accordance with the test method specified in NSF ANSI 372. So with that said, the key words there are intended, as well as water for human consumption through drinking or cooking. So with that in mind, we can take a look at the scope of the B125 standard. And when you look at the scope of the standard, the products that are affected by that clause or would have to meet the requirements of that clause are highlighted in red. So we're looking at E, drinking fountain supply fittings, as well as G, kitchen, sink, and laboratory supply fittings, and also supply stops. Now, because supply stops are used throughout the house, they are also included in this requirement. The other standard that was updated in 2012 was the B125.3 standard. And this standard also has basically the same clause, it's just a different clause number. So if we want to go to the scope of B125.3, here are the products that are affected by this scope. When we look at B, automatic compensating valves, other than those for in-wall mounted showering systems. You got supply line stops, again, up to 1 inch, and also temperature actuated inline mixing valves. Because those products felt that they could be intended to be used to convey water for drinking or for cooking. So these are the only two standards right now, B125.1 and B125.3, that are referenced in the National Plumbing Code of Canada. No other standards that have lead requirements are referenced at the current time. So to give you an update with regards to the other standards that are being worked on in order to get the lead requirements into those standards, I'm going to pass it over to Laurel and Ken from CSA.
Okay, so this is Ken Fu here. I'm just going to go over the list of completed standards that currently have the low lead requirements published. I'm going to start off with B137, which is your pressure plastic pipe. And the current standards that are affected are B137.0, B137.5, B137.8, B137.10, B137.11. Now, as Kevin mentioned, B125.1 and .3 are the only ones that are in the National Plumbing Code. So that being said, the B137 series has not been updated and referenced yet in the 2015 code. This will likely happen for the 2017-2018 mid-cycle update to the 2015 National Plumbing Code.
Hi everyone, it's Laurel. As Ken mentioned, B125.1 and B125.3 are referenced in the code. There's one other standard that we just published. It's CSA B55.2, and that's for drain water heat recovery. That contains the new low lead requirements, but is not yet in the code. To provide an update on the other standards that are being worked on to include these new requirements, we have ASME A112 18.6 and CSA B125.6 for flexible water connectors. We're expecting to publish that in 2017. We also have the tri-harmonized ASSC 1070, ASME A112.1070, CSA B125.70 for water temperature limiting devices. And we're expecting to publish that late this year, early next year. And Ken will go over some additional standards that he's been working on now.
Yeah, so there's a couple more on this list here that are a work in progress. B64, backflow preventers and vacuum breakers. B356, water pressure reducing valves for domestic water supply. Both are planned to be updated in the fall 2015 of this year. And right now we're also working on another B137 standard, and this is the B137.18 polyethylene of raised temperature resistance per tubing systems for pressure applications. And this will be updated as well in the fall of 2015. We're currently also working on B483.1 drinking water treatment systems, and this one looks like it should be updated in the spring or summer of 2016. Next speaker is going to be Franco DeFalco, Technical Advisor at CSA on the plumbing side. He's going to have a discussion on the certification side and some of the questions that we have come across recently.
Thank you, Ken. It's Franco DeFalco here. Thanks for everyone for joining me. I'm just going to give you a brief talk of some of the questions that have been coming through Kevin Wong's office here. And on the board there, you'll see the first one is NSF 61. And some of the typical questions are, you know, does NSF 61 require you to meet low lead? The simple answer is yes. The current version is up on the board, 2014A. In the standard, clause 3.5 and 3.6 talk to the requirements of the low lead. Although the language in the NSF 61 standard is somewhat weak when it comes to mandating the low lead, it's understandable that there's some confusion in the field. However, it's our opinion that the products that require to meet this standard must also meet the low lead requirements. Another issue that comes up is that the product standards that require NSF 61 or point to it don't always require the latest version of the standard, and that's where you get some confusion. So we'll talk about, Kevin will talk more about that in one of the standards he's going to talk about. The next item he has on the board there is large valves, and the issue is with valves greater than 1 inch. So valves greater than 1 inch are not included in the scope of the CSA B125 standard, and therefore weren't typically not certified to the mechanical plumbing standards in Canada. In the past, these types of devices often carried a certification to the NSF 61 standard. However, when the NSF 61 standard was updated to include low lead requirements, the valves did not meet these low lead requirements and were delisted. So currently, these valves do not carry any current certifications, which can pose a problem in the field when inspectors are used to seeing a certification mark and now don't see one. The next item is plastic pipe. Plastic pipe is covered under the B137 series, thermoplastic pressure piping standards that Ken talked about recently. We recently published an update to include the low lead requirements, and on the certification side we published a notice that announces these changes and sets an effective date of July 1st, 2016. So this means that all applicable products listed to the B137 standard would have to comply with the low lead requirements prior to the July 1st, 2016 effective date. And you would require to meet the low lead even though the code may not be referencing the latest version of the standard. So there's sort of a disconnect there. And on the last one, backflow, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Wong, who's going to speak more about that.
Hi, everybody. It just came to us a few weeks ago from a number of municipalities, and provincial code is referencing a version of B64, in some cases B64 2011. And while it doesn't have any specific low lead language written in, the committee is working on that right now, hopefully for publishing in the fall of this year. The standard does reference NSF 61 2010A. The NSF 61 2010A version of the NSF standard has included in it as an optional annex, Annex G, which is the low lead requirements. Some inspectors have asked the question whether or not the backflow preventers need to be low lead. In strictest interpretation of the standard, the answer is no, because that version of NSF makes the low lead requirements voluntary until the CFA V64 standard can specify the requirements. Only then can it actually become, it can kind of go live and then get referenced into the code and updated and then become a requirement. But at this point, the question and the interpretation stands that it's not required in Canada at the moment. In a few years, that might change fairly quickly. So pass on to Kevin Ernst. So what is regulated, which is probably the crux of the question here. I'll let him answer that.
So we've seen from the presentation that there's many standards that are in flux right now and changing and being updated. However, we want to come right down to it. What we're looking at is only B125.1 and B125.3 are, with their low lead requirements, are now referenced in the standard, or in the code, sorry. And so therefore, it's only the products affected by the scopes of those two standards that actually have to meet the requirements of low lead today. So that is the state of things right now. With that being said, however, as Franco alluded to, when a standard is updated, then a notification goes out to certification holders. And with that notification, they are required to update their certification records and be certified to the new requirements. And typically, they have a year or so. Franco, is that?
Yeah.
Typically, have about a year to be recertified to the new requirements. So while there may be a timeline yet for the National Plumbing Code to be updated with these new standards with the lead requirement, manufacturers will have to comply to many of these requirements for no lead because of the standards update. For instance, it's anticipated that B64 is going to be updated later this year, and that would mean that manufacturers would have to comply with those requirements probably by the end of 2016 or approximately. Franco?
Yeah.
That just gives you an idea. But as it stands today, from a purely regulatory perspective, purely National Plumbing Code perspective, only the products of B125.1 and B125.3 are referenced in the National Plumbing Code with low lead requirements. I hope that helps clear up any confusion and questions there may be. However, I'll pass it back to Kevin because we have a lot of time left for further questions.
Well, before we go any further, a number of inspectors asked some questions about markings, and what we discovered was some markings from the U.S. were coming across the border and showing up in Canada. So next slide really deals with, this is from the EPA website, probably one of the better sources as to what marks are out there. And if you scroll down to the Truesdale laboratories in the U.S., they're a very well-known and accredited laboratory according to ANSI, and unfortunately in Canada they are not accredited or recognized by the Standards Council of Canada. So we've seen a number of times where their marks have come across the border, and it's caused the inspectors some angst, some grief, and maybe even some concern. So just to keep an eye on what marks are allowed up here. It's a very disconcerting occurrence when it happens, and so far we've been able to deal with it, but we suspect as things move forward, you'll see more and more products leading across the border like this. So with that in mind, I'd like to open the floor up for some questions and see what comes in. So if anyone needs to start typing up their questions, go right ahead. Oh, we got one right now. First one is actually from a live question, and the answer is, the question is, does NSF 372 replace NSF 61 as the low lead requirement in the National Plumbing Code? There seems to be confusion with the authorities and engineers as to which NSF approval is actually allowed or are both allowed. Would anyone like to handle that question?
I can. So currently in the National Plumbing Code of Canada, neither standard is mandated or referenced. They're referenced within the product standard. So you have to go back to the product standard, and they're both mutually exclusive of each other. So if you're looking at the B125.1 and .3 standard, if your product is required to meet NSF 61, it would also have to meet NSF 372. So you would need both.
Thank you, guys. Steve here. I just want to reiterate, if you've got questions, you can type them into your question box. We will get to your question in order, so please be patient. We do have our first question for you, panel, from Anal. He asks, why aren't metering or self-closing supply fittings affected? Are metering labs exempt for some reason?
Yeah. So I can take a stab at that. So if you look in B125, obviously requires that that applicable products intended for cooking or human consumption meet the requirements of NSF 61 and 372. If you go into, if we talk about the word intended, those products, obviously the intent is not for anyone to drink or use it for cooking. We can anticipate people doing that, so that's where the discrepancy is. Also, if you take it one step further, those products are exempted in the NSF 61 section 9 of the standard.
Okay. Got a question from Raphael. He asks, which provinces are currently enforcing B125.1 and 3? And he asks, haven't most of them still not adopted the 2012 version of the National Code?
That information is actually on the CIPH website, because we do monitor that here at CIPH. And currently, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and PEI are the three holdouts to the latest version of the code. All of the provinces have essentially updated themselves to the latest version of the National Plumbing Code and the 2013 errata. And that's just an administrative issue that they had to deal with, and we support them. All the provinces across the border, evenly, and CIPH meets with them often and regularly to make sure and to lobby for them to update to the latest versions of the National Plumbing Code.
Okay. Andy asked a question. What's anticipated for large valves over, looks like over 1 inch?
That's actually a very, very interesting and contentious question. Right now, the CSA B125 committee has basically given their opinion that any valve larger than 1 inch is not covered under the CSA B125.3 standard. Sometime before the end of the summer, CIPH will be writing to the EPA to ask the question about 2 inch and greater valves, because right now there's an exemption with gate valves over 2 inch. Well, there's no difference between a butterfly valve, a gate valve, and a ball valve functionally. So we need to get an opinion on that from the EPA first before we even go back to NSF to ask the question on basically the Section 9 type products. That is work in progress and will be hopefully resolved, probably begun to be resolved by the end of the year. If everything goes.
Okay, we have a question, from Jeff. He actually wants you to sort of expand on the methods of enforcement, fines or penalties, etc. What do we anticipate?
In Canada, right now, the plumbing code and the provincial plumbing code is policed by your municipal or your provincially appointed plumbing inspectors, and the fines and the enforcement is done very much at the grassroots level. As a comparison, in the U.S., they have not made any rulemaking yet for enforcement or penalties or what have you. So, in one sense, Canada is a little bit more ahead on that because it was our
at inventory.
Well, with the standards, manufacturers have a year to become recertified to the new requirement. And typically, when a jurisdiction adopts, when the standard gets adopted into the code, and then the jurisdiction adopts that code, there is a grandfather period, usually of 6 months or so, or even longer. In addition to, they usually have a date, and this is jurisdiction by jurisdiction, whereby they say, typically with the building permits dated prior to a certain date, will be allowed to have the old requirements, and building permits dated afterwards would be required to be to the new requirements. So there's where there is a time frame given, or an opportunity given for old inventory to make its way through the pipeline.
And from a standards development issued when we begin work on either a new standard, new addition, or an amendment, the only time it really becomes public as to what the changes are is when the document goes out for public comment. And usually that's done for 60 days. So at that point, you let the and can provide feedback or comment.
Okay. Question from Doug. Doug asks, for water circulators used in pumping potable water specifically for DHW recirculation or space heating, what are the
Actually, Doug, I don't know the answer to that question, but I will definitely ask CNRC or potentially even one of our local codes writers who could give us some idea on that one. Officially, you're going to something on that one for now. So the question is noted, and we'll get back to you.
Right. And then, yeah, just to note, we mentioned at the beginning, the panel, in all its wisdom, may not be able to answer all your questions, but they will refer your questions on to the appropriate authorities and get back to you, should they not have the full information. Question from William. William asks, can CSA require the lead requirement language be the same in all the standards despite the committee's different opinions?
Yeah, no, the CSA does not dictate what technical content goes into the standard. It's really up to the committee to decide that. So each committee may make their own decision.
With that said, it's Kevin Ernst here. We do endeavor to try to make sure the wording is the same, so to avoid confusion. However, we're not always able to do that depending on the individuality of the TC, but we do work towards that goal. Currently, the B125 series is having all the same language put into it.
Question from Thomas. Thomas's question is, standards B125.1 and 125.3 don't discriminate on valves or fittings for copper or iron pipe. Why are valves and fittings for PEX apparently classified differently outside of these standards? Or is that assumption incorrect?
I'm not sure I understand. I understand the question.
No, we're all sort of chattering amongst ourselves here. We don't fully understand his question.
Could you repeat it, Stephen?
Sure. The question is, standards B125.1 and 125.3 don't discriminate on valves or fittings for copper or iron pipe. Why are valves and fittings for PEX apparently classified differently or outside of these standards? Or Is that assumption incorrect?
I think that's a question for the CSA technical committees, and we can submit it to them for maybe some kind of opinion or.
Is he referring to the connections for the valves, meaning PEX connections?
I think so.
Regardless of the connections for a valve, it would still have to meet the requirements of the applicable standard. Whether the connections are threaded connections or solder connections or PEX connections, if the valve is a valve that's covered by the scope of B125.3, say, or .1, then it would have to meet the requirements of those standards. I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but that's...
Yeah, he has responded here, and there's a couple of people who are saying why PEX bit fittings are in B137 and B125. And Thomas actually says the broad definitions of B125.1 and 25.3 on valves and fittings are simply regarding the types of devices independent of pipe type, except for PEX.
Now, B125 is supply fittings. When B137, however, is the fittings that connect PEX pipe together. Ken, maybe you can make sure I've...
Yeah, that's correct.
Whereas B125 is the actual supply fitting. Not, yeah, there's a difference of product there.
Okay. Michael asks, and maybe we covered this before and maybe on the website, but is there a specific time frame for lead-free to be enforced in Canada?
No, there isn't. As the standards get updated, they'll be, through the process, adopted or referenced into the appropriate codes and adopted by the provinces. So the intention is to have this be a work in progress until we get ourselves done. We started with the B125 series. As you guys saw, B137 and B55 has been updated. As we move forward, there will be other standards to be updated. Manufacturers will get their informs and their notices to, update their certifications to their various standards. And as we move forward, we'll get updated into the actual reference into the actual code. So it is an ever-changing situation here in Canada. I don't know if I'm not too sure if there is a timeline, but I hope it would end someday. Not to be funny, but it's true.
The intention is to accomplish that all products that come into contact with drinking water or water intended for use for cooking shall comply with that lead requirement. Now it's our task of the technical committees to identify what all standards are affected by that requirement, and therefore work with the technical committees to get the words into those standards as quickly as possible. So it may not be just CSA standards, it could be other standards as well that could be affected.
Question from Erica. She asks, why did Canada decide to take a different approach than the U.S.?
I probably can steal that question. Health Canada, actually Franco would probably be the ideal person to steal this question, but and I know she's on the webinar listening, but Health Canada would have been able to put a regulation in place, but like the U.S., enforcement and policing of that order of that piece of regulation would have been difficult or problematic because they're not tied to the plumbing code in any manner, in any which way. So we had seen early on that enforcement at the grassroots would have been a challenge, as those who work in the U.S. see today. So we decided, we didn't decide this, but the industry advised that if we do this, we should do it through the codes and standards system, so that we can, incorporate the change all the way from the policy and codes development point of view, the standards that manufacturers certify to, and the inspections that happen in the field as products get installed and put in.
Okay. William asks, with the exception of supply line stops because of flow rate in your table 1, does not see any up to 1-inch limitations.
Those limitations are actually built into the standards, and I'll let Kevin and Franco answer that.
historically, if you go back in the B125 standard, the scope did say 1 inch and less. When the standard was harmonized with ASME, some of that wording was lost. However, the intent was still there. And also, if you look, I forget which table number it is, but there is a table which only goes up to 1 inch size. And Franco might be able to talk a little bit more specific to that.
Yeah, I don't remember the table number offhand, but yeah, in the earlier versions of the standard, the scope actually had a limitation of 1 inch. Once the standards were harmonized, that language sort of got taken out, but the tables only go up to 1 inch, so we can infer that the standard only covers up to 1 inch, and that's where the 1 inch comes into play.
Okay. Question from Robert. I will handle this. Robert asks, will this presentation be available online somewhere in the near future or for future reference? Robert, first of all, for everyone who's on the call here, you will all be receiving a copy of the recording of this presentation in your inbox. Also, we will be posting a copy of the recording of the webinar on the CIPH.com website. But to start off, you will get a link most likely later this afternoon. Jeff has a question. He'd like you to please clarify regarding products certified to NSF 61372 by Truesdale Labs. They are ANSI certified, but apparently not recognized by the Standards Council of Canada. And his question is, are these products considered in compliance and approved for sale in Canada?
The answer is essentially no in some jurisdictions, and here's why. There are a couple of jurisdictions that actually say that this product needs to be certified, for lack of a better term, and the certifier must be recognized or accredited by the Standards Council of Canada. So it makes it awfully difficult when the mark is not something that SEC recognizes. So that's why Truesdale has been a bit of a hiccup in Canada. We've worked with them. We know they do good work, and but they've never gone through the accreditation process here in Canada, so their mark cannot be recognized.
Steve, it's a second. I can go back to that previous question with regards to valves 1 inch. And when you go to the B125.3 standard, what happens is Table 1 has operating requirements, and it goes up to ½ inch, and it says supply line stops larger than ½ inch. However, when you go to Table 2 for flow rates, it ends at 1 inch. There's no requirements beyond 1 inch for minimum flow rate. And the intention there is that the standard is only for supply fittings up to 1 inch.
But to answer Matt's question, to finish off with Matt's question, thanks, Kev, is just because you're anti-certified or anti-accredited doesn't mean you're SEC accredited. So Canada and the U.S. are two different countries. That's a very important thing to understand. As I said right at the beginning, this talk is for Canada. So I hope that answers your question.
Just going back to that, and I don't know if you've answered this with this question from Andy with regards to up to 1 inch, said so then ball valves will be required to be certified to CSA 125.3, less than and up to 1 inch. Right now, no valves have required any certification, and no plumbing code conformance standards have ever been enforced. So this is new.
Oh. Yeah, well, the B125.3 is referenced in the NPC. So if a jurisdiction has adopted the B125.3 standard or adopted the National Plumbing Code, therefore valves of the 1 inch should be required to meet the requirement.
It's Kevin Wong here, and Kevin is absolutely correct in a plumbing system. I think Andy's trying to get at what's going to happen in an engineered system or a commercial site where it's not really, it may not be plumbing, it might be process piping or something else. Asking whether or not the product needs to be CSA B125.3. In the past, NSF 61 would have sufficed for the authority having jurisdiction.
All right. Question from Ray. Ray asks, there are some products which do not fall under any of the standards you mentioned. For example, threaded bronze fittings, and you referenced ASME B16.15. When are these products going to be regulated for lead-free?
Well, in the case of Canada's approach, it would be when the standard that those fittings are certified to has the low lead requirements added to them. I'm also chair of what's called the Plumbing Industry Advisory Council, and that's an industry group created by CIPH. And within this group, we are looking at the National Plumbing Code and trying to identify other standards that affect products that come into contact with drinking water or water intended to be used for cooking. And we were going to research as to whether or not they had low lead requirements written into them yet or not, just to try to see what kind of scope we're looking at as far as what other standards need to be looked at and updated in order to get complete compliance in Canada. So that's a big job and a lot of work, but that's what we're trying to endeavor to accomplish.
Question from John. John asks, is there a definition of a supply stop/valve and its location to an end device?
There is a definition in the standard for a supply line stop. And the definition for B125 is a supply line stop, which is typically a stop that's in line. And then there's a supply stop, which is typically just upstream of a terminal fitting. So the definition in the B125.3 standard for a supply line stop states a valve used to control the flow or water in a distribution system except a supply stop. And a supply stop is a valve that is placed immediately upstream of a terminal fitting to shut off the water supply to the terminal fitting so that it can be serviced or replaced. There's actually the two definitions there, a supply line stop and a supply stop.
Question from Raphael. Where will updates on the adoption of the new standards be posted online?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think it through as to...
So far, for CSAB 125, CIPH has been posting updates to that as we scan the provinces. We've been doing that for the last year and a half. For the other standards, that's something that will be coming as we move through the system. CSA provides updates in their CSA Informs documents, which are posted online and on their communities of interest. And manufacturers and the certificate holders, those who have certified product, will also probably have information as their certification bodies notify them. So it's in multiple places you can actually find the information.
Okay. Mark has a comment and then a question. He says, without something in writing telling users, engineers, etc., you need that first. His question is, can a bulletin be issued that he can point to that states that large valves have no lead requirements as per the National Plumbing Code?
I have a suspicion by the fall, once we get everything clarified with the EPA and potentially with NSF, the group, or we might be putting some kind of a statement or guidance out to assist engineers and municipalities as to how to treat larger valves. At this time, we've just gotten to step one, and that was getting an opinion or an answer from the CSAB 125.3 committee. We now have to go back to EPA and to NSF to ask them as to how to address these things. For anything greater than 1 inch.
Anything greater than 1 inch. Question from Carrie asks, how will the import non-compliant products be addressed in order to maintain a level playing field?
Imported products will be treated the same way as manufactured products here. The playing field is essentially already leveled.
This is where the certification marks come in play. If a product that's being imported has a certification, then of course they have a certification file with the certification body, and therefore they would be subject to ongoing plant inspections and compliance. So they would have to be complying to the new requirements of the standards if they're certified to it. Short of that, then if a product's coming in with no markings, then of course that becomes an enforcement issue in the field by the plumbing authorities.
That's one of the reasons why we chose this route for Canada, because right now in the U.S. there's no rulemaking on enforcement or penalties or anything else. And even when the EPA does get somebody who's put a report in, there's not much they can do about it. So that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is right now until they can figure out their rulemaking process.
In Canada, if a plumbing official finds non-compliant product, then he can have it removed at the expense of the people involved. If a certification body is made aware of possible counterfeit product, they too can take action legally against that product.
Andy has a question. Andy asks, how do we educate the inspectors to recognize the Truesdale laboratory symbols?
As to what it means and the fact that they're not accredited in Canada, CIPH puts out a marks bulletin every year to give the inspectors what the accredited marks are for the plumbing and heating industry. And that is available on the website and will be circulated as part of this package at the end of the webinar.
Okay. Question again from Mark. In B125.3, only those items in red are the only those items in red are the only products affected by the no lead. Excuse me, let me start from the beginning there. In B125.3, only those items in red are the only products affected by the no lead requirement. An example: flushometer valves and solenoid valves, where they are clearly not intended for human consumption, but is clearly not stated in 4.15.
Now that's flushometer valves, and those are in B125.3. And yeah, they are not required to be to the no lead requirement. Right?
Yeah, that's correct. The solenoid valves, if it was in an application where it's for drinking and human consumption, could possibly be required to meet those requirements.
Okay, so there's a clarification there that maybe we should have yellowed solenoid valves, yeah. Depending on the application.
Okay, question from Robert. Robert asks, are trap primers required to be low lead? Specifically saying the water diverted to a trap is not for human consumption, but the other water traveling through the device may or may not go to a faucet that is for human consumption.
Primers. The opinion here is that trap primers would not be required to be for the no lead requirement. Trap primers are in B125.3 scope.
Erica asks, who's liable if a leaded product is installed where CSA code calls for no lead?
Well, it's a code issue rather than a CSA issue. If someone has installed a product that is shown not to comply to the requirements of the code, which would mean that it doesn't comply to the requirements of the standard, then the person installing it would be up to the jurisdiction and how they will enforce that. So that it requires removal or whatever they would require. But that's the jurisdiction's responsibility. for enforcement and what they will be required to do.
Okay. Question from Carol. What about electronic laboratory and kitchen faucets? Will they both fall in CSA 125.1 and .3 eventually?
Indeed.
Yeah, they're currently covered under the CSAB 125.1 as a kitchen sink and laboratory supply fittings.
Two questions from Andy. He asks, the supply line stops, that's ball valves and gate valves in distribution system has not been certified to be 125.3. Are the manufacturers aware and updating their valves?
Well, I think that many of the certification bodies would have notified their manufacturer clients probably starting in about November of last year. That's when we started hearing about this. That this was happening, specifically when they started losing their NSF 61 certifications. So, yes, the certification bodies have been notifying their clients as they go through this.
Yeah, I can talk for CSA. We have a program that will certify products just to the NSF 61 standard, and all those products have been updated and meet low lead as of before the January 4th, 2014 deadline that was in the U.S. So if those valves were certified by CSA to the NSF 61 standard, they're already updated. Or delisted, yes, of course.
His second question is, over half the trap primers are flow-through valve to faucets, no different than the supply line stops. Should they not be certified? Should they not be certified?
If they were integral part of the supply fitting, then typically then they were required to meet the low lead. If they're on their own, then they probably wouldn't have to meet it.
Mark, to answer your question, the CIPH website is www.ciph.com, and I'm mentioning again that you will receive a copy of the broadcast of this webinar in your inbox. We will be posting it to the website shortly, but you'll get it to your individual inbox sooner than that. And that's the last of the questions that we have here. While we're waiting to see if any more come in, I will just mention again, we will be sending you a survey of this webinar, and if you do have questions that you want to submit to the panel after the fact, after the session is ended, they will be available. We will give you their contact information, and they will endeavor to answer any questions that you have.
Steve, I have one last question.
Sure.
And this one comes from, actually it was an inspector, and he asked, if the Provincial Safe Drinking Water Act defines the performance basis for lead in water, why do I have to apply NSF 372 or NSF 61 directly to a system specification? And that's a municipal question, and I think we may end up referencing that probably to the Ministry of Environment or to our friends at the CWWA.
Okay. We've got another question come in. I'm ready. When will stainless steel piping be approved for potable water?
I think it's in the 2015 code. I'm not 100% sure, but I will note that question and double check with Patrick Tardif at the NRC.
Okay. Do we have any more questions out there? We've got quite a bit of information that has been provided by the panel. I think some valuable information. What we can do is, what we'll do is we'll send out the evaluation, and you'll be able to submit the questions. I think that's it for now. As I say, this webinar will be posted on the website. You will get a copy of it. Look for our survey in your inbox. I think that's it for questions, gentlemen. Was there any wrap-up that you wanted to do?
No, everyone, thank you for your questions, and I hope this session has been informative and provide the answers, the burning questions you had. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me. My email is k.wong@ciph.com, and I will circulate it to the appropriate people. All right, guys. Thank you for everything, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.